Your trauma is actually the source of your greatest calling. I wish more people knew this, because the more that you dive into your trauma to understand it and to understand what story or program you're living in, that might be subconscious, it might not be something you totally understand, but the more you understand it and work to understand and work on it and unravel it, the more you step into the calling, which is the reason why you are here.
What is going on, everybody? Guys, welcome back this week to another amazing, guys, very impactful, jam-packed episode of the Superhuman Life. As always, guys, I'm your host, Frank Rich. And before we get into introducing today's guest, let me just remind you how incredibly grateful and thankful we are to have you here with us today. Guys, episode 135. At the releasing of this episode, guys, I believe we have we will be hitting our 3-year mark here within the next week. It may have been the last week. It may be up and coming here in the next week or so. But 3 years, it's hard to believe that July 8th, 2019, this entire thing started, guys. I was a man on a mission. Back then, I had a story that I wanted to share with the world. And what has come out of that has been far beyond what I could ever possibly imagine. And it's all because of you guys. So if you're new here, thank you for tuning in. Guys, if you've been with us since the beginning, I want to thank you. The growth of this show, the impact, the guests we've been able to get on here is all because of you. And if you want to continue to help us level up and grow and reach more people, you can support us in one of two ways. First off, if you're watching here on YouTube, make sure to hit that subscribe button, guys. We drop these episodes every single Monday. But if you're on the audio side, whether you're listening on Apple, whether you're listening on Spotify, Podbean, whatever the platform is out there, guys, reviews are what drives podcast growth. It tells the algorithm that this show is meaningful, this show is impactful, and it's actually producing quality for people's lives. So if you haven't done so yet, it'd mean the world to us to leave a 5-star rating and written review. But guys, today we have a powerhouse of a guest. Powerhouse is the best way to describe her. Yatch. Annie is a charismatic force of nature with an uncanny ability to influence and empower elite business owners using world-class leadership principles. Guys, she is the co-owner of SEAL Team Leaders. You guys may remember back 6-7 episodes, we had Lieutenant Larry Yatch. So Annie is Larry's ex-wife, but they are business partners. Incredible relationship. I met both of them in Nashville a few months ago. And guys, just a dynamic duo of a powerhouse couple here. Not a couple, but powerhouse business. So in this conversation, Annie and I really dive deep into the trauma side of things. She worked with Larry when he was in the SEALs, and she is a behavioral change expert. So we dive deep into trauma. Just what is trauma? Why is trauma a part of all of our lives? And why do some people seem to hold on to their trauma more than others? We then get into so many discussion points around this, the healing of trauma, how we need to begin to write new stories for ourselves. What role does our gut health play in our ability for our brain to have the changes necessary to heal ourselves from the trauma? We talk about some of the spiritual side of things, just a jam-packed conversation. So guys, if you have things in your life that are holding you back, if you are not where you want to be, if there's things that you want to be doing, but you're not, and if there's constant stories that you keep telling yourself, this is the conversation for you guys. So without further ado, let's get into today's conversation with Annie Yatch. Hope you guys enjoy. Annie, welcome to the Superhuman Life.
Thanks, Frank. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so excited to dive into today's conversation. To let the audience know, so Annie was a speaker at an event that I was at a few months ago. And anybody that's ever had like a younger brother or has maybe been like the older kid, like in a pack, I feel like I was that annoying little brother throughout the entire weekend with Annie, because right when I met her, it was just like the way that she spoke. I was just like so interested in the way that you thought, in the way that your mind worked and what you had to say. So I'm excited to share you with the audience because I got so much out of those 3 or 4 days that we spent together, Annie. So thank you for joining me here today.
You are so welcome. And thank you. I had a blast getting to know you too.
Yeah, well, let's see if we could pull out some of that wisdom that you had there. So you've been all over the place in kind of your career. I mean, from I think getting into in college, you were interested in like international intelligence. Is that correct?
Yes, and counterterrorism. So I
Counterterrorism.
Correct.
So what's the story with there? Like what was young Annie interested in that made her pursue that?
Well, I think back in the day, I loved languages. I spoke French, German, and a little bit of Arabic at the time. And to be honest, I just thought that there's got to be a better way of creating connections with people overseas. And at the time, I was being mentored by the only female attorney at the CIA, and she was trying to get me to consider going to law school and then coming on board to be her mentee, so that I would be working, on all these international cases, which I thought would be so fascinating. And then, hunting, tracking terrorists. I thought, hey, that's a good way to keep the world safe. So
Yeah.
that's how it started.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And for the audience, so Annie is business partners with a previous guest. And guys, if you haven't done so yet, after this conversation, go check out the episode a few episodes back with Larry. So you guys have multiple businesses together. Now I know it's a lot on the SEAL team side, but you're a behavioral change expert. Was that how you would kind of define yourself?
Yes. That's a perfect way of phrasing it. Basically, I like looking at all the behaviors that none of us really enjoy anymore, that we're like, oh, I'd love to get rid of that behavior. Well, that's what I like to do. I like to change that behavior sustainably so that it doesn't cause you trouble any longer.
Yeah, and this is a product of the work that you did working with the SEALs, or where did this really become like your area of focus and expertise?
Well, I'm going to get a little vulnerable here and share a little bit, because if anyone's watched Larry's presentation with you and the time that you guys spent together, he is my former spouse. He is an absolutely genius man. And he and I went through about 15 years of very intense trauma recovery work together, due to both his background and my background. It was during those 15 years that we tried literally everything we could think of to try to help him and me too, work through our traumas so that we could be more in sync as a couple. What was really interesting though was during that time frame, we started identifying that in business, the unresolved trauma of the CEO actually caused a lot of trouble for the team and the team's ability to hold to systems, processes, and procedures. So when we saw that, we're like, oh my goodness, we better start with the trauma piece and help CEOs there or entrepreneurs there before we go into all the systems and the processes. So that's where actually a lot of the work that we now do with teams started from that personal journey that he and I were taking to heal ourselves and to become the best versions for our kids.
And I absolutely love how you guys approach this, right? Like you don't see a lot of people in the business consulting or coaching space coming at it through. You never hear healing. You never hear healing in a business conference. Very rarely do you hear it. But hearing you guys, it's like, that is for a lot of the guys, that's the barrier that they need to break through. And what I'd like to do maybe now, Annie, is like, I don't want to open it up. I don't want to just speak specifically to business owners. I know that's kind of the world that you live in. I think trauma is obviously something that impacts everybody, right? So let's really kind of open the conversation up around trauma, because I think that there's some misconceptions around what it is. I have my opinions, and I'm curious to kind of go here with you today. So when you talk about trauma, let's just define it first of all. Like, what is trauma, and how does that impact somebody's life? Whether it's business, whether it's relationships, whether it's their own mental health, just in general. So trauma, and then what is the impact that it has on somebody's life?
Well, trauma, most of us don't like hearing the word trauma, right? Because trauma sounds like something we're all trying to avoid a little bit. But what we have learned is that as a young child between the age of 5 and 10, there's typically a story that we create in our mind that is a non logical story that helps us to cope with something big that happens to us, right? So trauma actually comes from a story that you create in your pre logical brain between the age of 5 and 10. And what happens for most of us is at that young age, we create a story and we use that story over and over again. Our subconscious brain starts to create that in every aspect of our life. So you've heard that we basically create our own worlds. Our perception is under control. That's what happens as a little kid. And we start playing out that story over and over and over again. And that story or the lesson that we learn from it is actually the trauma that we first experience. So trauma can be big, it can be little, but in essence, it's basically just a lesson that we learn that we're working through.
So what I'm hearing you say though, and I'm sorry to do that. I'm not trying to straw man you here, but um, if it's a story that we're telling between the ages of 5 and 7 or 7 and 10, I've always said this. Like, if you're an adult walking the earth today, you have some elements of trauma. I see so many people, it's like they hold on to these past traumas as like that becomes the barrier, whether it's breaking through to an addiction, breaking through in all these areas. You've seen it, right? It's like they hold on to this thing. It's like, no, this trauma happened to me in the past, so I'm always going to be broken. It's almost that becomes their identity as a traumatized individual. But what I'm hearing you say is if you get to this point where we're at, like past 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, you're going to have some form of trauma in your life. Is that correct?
Everyone has trauma in their lives. It just is a matter of if it's a little trauma or if it's a big trauma. So every single one of us has trauma. And the benefit is, like, I wish if nobody heard anything else in this entire podcast but this one thing, please listen. Your trauma is actually the source of your greatest calling. I wish more people knew this because the more that you dive into your trauma to understand it and to understand what story or program you're living in, that might be subconscious, it might not be something you totally understand, but the more you understand it and work to understand and work on it and unravel it, the more you step into the calling, which is the reason why you are here.
I know you probably don't see this in the circles that you work in with business executives, right? Like you're operating at, you're working with high performers that are trying to get to that next level, 8 figures, trying to get to 9 or 7, trying to get to 8. But I see it kind of in my space, right? In the addiction field or the mental health space. It's like you see this trauma becomes that identity. So that person that is holding on to, that is attaching themselves to this thing happened in my past. It could be bigger, it could be little. So I don't want to, I don't want to say like you've had major things like that. It's not going to have an impact on you. But the person that's holding on to the trauma, what do you say to them first? Because they need to be able to remove themselves first to then be able to begin to do any of the work that they're going to heal from it.
Well, I actually had this happen the other day. I was coaching just people who are in business together, right? They're not necessarily business owners, but I was coaching them. And what I started to see was the same loop of thought was coming up over and over again. And the person wasn't even aware that they were stuck in the same loop. And so what I said to the person was, I said, okay, I'm like, are you aware that you are saying the same thing over and over again? And the same fear is showing up in every aspect of every conversation. And she was like, no, I don't think I'm doing that. And it was her business partner at the time who said to her, actually, you are. And then we reread back to her what she had said. And she's like, oh my God, I think that 24/7 in my head all the time. She's like, but I didn't realize I was saying it out loud and arguing that point over and over again. She had no conscious awareness that she was doing it. So for me, I'm always looking for what is the pattern, that negative looping thought that I hear over and over and over again. And then how do I unravel that to get to the deeper trauma? Because if the person can't see it and isn't aware that it's happening, you can't get any movement to help them with the working through of the trauma.
And are there consistent themes or consistent patterns that you see people falling into or reoccurring stories? Like I know everybody's going to have a specific incident, but does the story kind of fall into, a handful of categories here?
Well, Larry and I are just now starting to dig into the 140 different people whose traumas we've run through and started to identify that there are about 18 different pieces of trauma that we see. And from there are probably 10 to 15 different themes. So, some themes are everything from I'm not lovable to, one person had a pretty dramatic fear of death. Another person had a fear of failure. It's just interesting to see. There's also a lot of victim mentality that is linked to trauma because in trauma, you try to basically try to isolate yourself from others and disconnect, which then causes a lot of that feeling of now everybody else but me is to blame for my circumstances. So what I always look for is if someone's in victim mentality and it's everybody else but them, or if they're caught in that negative loop where it's the same pattern of thought over and over again, you know that you're getting very close to a childhood wounding that they've used as a program to try to survive and stay safe, but it might not serve them in their current environment.
I've heard you say, I think it was with Vince, that trauma comes out of an incident where you've lost control or you don't have control. Is this something that
A perceived loss of control.
perceived loss of
Correct. You have a
control? So
loss of
is
control.
that what's leading to the victim kind of mindset mentality? Is like I'm perceiving that I don't have control, so clearly I'm a victim to whatever is happening to me, the circumstances, situations, so forth and so forth.
Well, it could be that, or it could be that, it's a little kid between the age of 5 and 10, and they don't believe they have control anyway, but that perceived loss of control helps them create a story that is not at all logical, but it's what fits what they know to be true. And so then you have a little kid who's basically creating the story that this isn't my fault, or sometimes it is their fault, right? So it can be this isn't my fault, and then you go right into perhaps victim mentality, or this is my fault, and everything is this person's issue moving forward, right? So it's very unique how the brain does it, but based on that little child and what that child is experiencing, they're going to come up with something, even if it makes no sense. And that story is going to become the program that drives their subconscious brain. And that subconscious brain is running at 11 million data points a second, and the conscious brain only can take 40 data points a second. So you're basically, every single one of us is run by that subconscious brain with the trauma leading the charge, which is a wild concept. Like your entire perception of the world is based on those 11 million data points. And that those are based on the story and the program you came up with as a young kid to survive.
The subconscious brain has 11 million data points per second. The conscious brain has 40.
40.
So when we look out in the world, literally the world that we're perceiving and seeing is being ran and controlled. I mean, at that scale, 11 million to 40, like if you had took that down to the ratio, that's what percentage of what we see is being controlled subconsciously, and then a very small percentages of what we're actually consciously aware of.
Correct. And that's what's wild, because if you think about it, if our whole perception of the world is based on the subconscious brain almost, and we don't even know what the subconscious brain program or story is around our trauma, then we literally have no idea what's running our lives.
You keep using this word story. So does that mean that the path to healing this is going to be you have to rewrite the story at a subconscious level? Is that even possible? Like,
well, that's what Larry and I actually figured out how to do,
okay,
which is pretty incredible. And the way we do it is we use the concept of cognitive dissonance, right? So you can't have, like, for example, say I have a green iPhone case. I say this was fully green. I couldn't say, hey, this is green and it also is white. It can't be both of those things at once. It's either green or it is white. And so we use that concept by creating, okay, if the story that you have in your mind, which used to be true when you were a little kid, if we use that story and then we juxtapose it, we compare it to a truth that might be a completely different story, you can only have one thing exist as the truth in your mind at any one time. So you can either choose the old story, the old truth, or you can choose a new truth that's more in alignment with your current environment and the reality of who you are today. So that's where if you try to hold both, you can't. You can only hold one or the other. The key is giving each person the choice to say, okay, in the past, I thought this was true, but what do I want to be true? And if I want this to be true, how do I act accordingly? And then it removes this other untruth from having power in your life.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. I'm gonna ask you to kind of rip apart something that's kind of mine here. Maybe it's mine. Maybe I heard it somewhere else, and now I'm trying to make it mine. But I'm not an expert here in this space. But there's elements of some of these things that come up in my work, in the conversations with our men, whether coaching group, whatever. And I've had a handful of clients that have been holding on to some things that have happened in their past. And they're like, they're struggling to get breakthroughs in their recovery. It's like, because this happened and this happened in a relationship, or when my dad and these, and I was like, okay, what we need to understand is like, the past is the past. It's already happened. We're trying to create a new future for you. So how do you need to interpret the past to be able to create the future that you're trying to get to? And that was kind of just something I said, and like I pulled back and I was like, yeah, it was really good, Frank. Like that actually sounded amazing. Like, are there holes or gaps in there, or maybe we can now kind of take that and say like, okay, how can we actually begin to rewrite those past events?
So one of the exercises that I take people through quite a bit as I'm doing coaching, I think this will be relevant for your audience 100%. So what I do is I take them through this practice where I'm like, okay, I want you to imagine and visualize, and I'm going to use a personal life example because I think it makes it easier to understand. So I had a former boyfriend when I was in college who would let other girls sit on his lap. And he was doing it because he wanted me to show enough excitement and desire to be with him that I would go over and tell those girls to get off his lap so that I would then sit on his lap, right? Now, I never would go over and interrupt. So I'm like, if he doesn't want to be with me, then he doesn't want to be with me. I'm not going to interrupt the situation with this other girl. Now, what's interesting about it is as I grew up and I got older, I had a lot of like almost like resentment that he would do that. I felt like it was disrespectful, right? So I was carrying this sort of wounding inside of me that a man wouldn't respect and admire me enough to ask me to sit on his lap if he was dating me. So this is very vulnerable share here, right? So what I did to work through this was I pictured every single environment or moment where he would ask somebody else to sit on his lap. I would envision in my head, okay, knowing what I know of myself now, knowing how I live in so much unconditional love, how would I have approached that scenario with the knowledge and the skill set and the person that I am today? And I would basically pretend that I went back in time and I went into that old form of who I was. And I would go over to him and I would basically say to the girl, hey, would you mind moving? This is my guy. And I would sit down, and I would hold his face in my visualization and be like, hey, I'm right here. You don't have to, wonder where I am or wonder if I'm interested. I'm like, I'm right here and I want to be with you. And so I did that for every situation that I had been in. I recreated the narrative, I recreated the story, I recreated the feeling, and I stepped into it with my current knowledge of who I am. And by doing that, every single moment healed because I was no longer living in that old story of who I used to be. So I ask everyone, I'm like, think of it as you're going back in time to create the reality, almost like Back to the Future, right? You're going back in time to create the reality that you most want to live in. So you ask yourself, what do I want to be true in this story instead? And then you create that in your visualization, in your imagination, in your mind, and you feel what that feels like, and it heals you. It heals you from the past and anything that's going on in the present. It's really a beautiful experience.
I want to ask you something specifically about me, if you're okay with that. I think it'll
Sure.
be I
Yeah,
think it'll be
go
valuable for the
on.
audience. So I was just being interviewed here earlier this afternoon, and the gentleman interviewing me was like, "Frank, I wish I had you." Like he was a little bit older, mid to late 40s. And he got vulnerable and started sharing like some of his own struggles with pornography. And he's like, "I really wish I would have had somebody like you when you were 20." And I think the reason I've been able to create as much content, I mean, over the last 2+ years, literally a video every single day on YouTube, is when I sit down to, or when I stand up to speak, like in front of the camera, it's like I'm just thinking about younger Frank, like back in the day. A lot of my content are like the problems and things that I went through, like my own struggles. And I wasn't intentionally doing this, like using my content almost as a way to like heal myself. Does that make any sense?
Heal, to heal yourself. 100%. That's what you're doing. And that's what each of us have a chance to do. And that's why you're in your calling, right?
Oh,
Do you see what I mean now when I say your
wow.
biggest is because the more you reveal and dig into it, and the more you're vulnerably able to share it, the more you heal. The more you heal, the more you step into your calling. So there's no doubt in my mind that the reason why you're doing what you're doing is because that younger Frank needed to heal. And now you're inspiring all these men to shift their behavior patterns and to live a more connected life. And that is your calling because your trauma directed it.
I'm
Just blows the mind. Like that's why we're all here.
I'm good. Like I'm done. We could shut this off and like, but I don't want to.
Like best podcast ever.
Well, I asked you what would make the best one ever, and you're like, before I even recorded, it's the best one. I was like, well, we've far surpassed that here today. So what about like adult incidences, things that happen to us in adulthood, right? You said at the beginning, like trauma is a story that we begin to tell ourselves between the ages of 5 and 7 or 7 and 10. But you see a lot of adults. Obviously, you worked with Larry and the SEALs. These guys are seeing, I mean, like massive trauma. I don't know if massive is the right word there, but even in some of like the work that I do, so I'm involved in some human trafficking organizations here. You get these women, teenage, young adulthood, they're raped, they're sold, and that creates this trauma. So how do events that happen to us in adulthood bring us back to those stories, or is this a different element of trauma?
Well, the hard part about this is for many people, they'll try to replay and recreate the same trauma, only different context from when they were young. So some adult trauma is still the same story playing out from that early 5 to 10-year-old range. Right? Now, some adult trauma can happen where there's a perceived loss of control in the day to day of, say, entrepreneurs in the business world, right? There is a consistent perceived loss of control when you're an entrepreneur in business, but a lot of that comes from that pre logical state as a little kid that you created that you're now recreating just in a different context in the context of business. So when adults have trauma that happens, that perceived loss of control, they go through so many different ways to let it go, right? From our perspective, in order to let go of trauma, you have to cover four different levels. You have to be able to address it intellectually, you have to address it emotionally, you have to address it physically, and you have to address it through the neurochemistry. Now, where most people miss is they miss the neurochemical side of it, right? Because you can have somatic body practitioners that help work it out of your body physically. You can have people that work with you on the emotional side using EMDR or tapping to release those emotions. You can do it intellectually by understanding, okay, here's the old truth that I thought was real that no longer exists. Here's the new truth. How can I intellectually think of only that new truth? What do I want to be true for me moving forward? So those are those three pieces. But that neurochemical piece, people just don't think about it. And that's the missing gap, I think, in a lot of trauma work.
Mm. So you mentioned up a couple, you listed off a couple, therapeutic practices there, EMDR and somatic therapy. Can you kind of, maybe expand on a little bit of the neurochemistry side of things and maybe give some context or details to those specific ones? And then if you don't have access to somatic therapist or EMDR, is there other paths that people can take? Something like Dr. Caroline's neurocycle or anything, or maybe some of the things that you guys do.
Sure. One of the things that I found so fascinating about the neurochemistry is if you think about it, everyone's nervous system was created from the biome of their mother. Because when you come through the birth canal, or even if you don't, you either get all that bacteria that creates the biome of your gut, and the biome of your gut actually changes the neurochemistry of your brain. So that's why when we talk about generational trauma, it's because you're actually inheriting some of that DNA and some of that bacteria from your parents. Right now, the thing that's really interesting about the neurochemistry side is because our guts are so unhealthy in this day and age, we're not telling the brain to release certain chemicals. So all of our nervous systems are ratcheted much higher than they need to be. So we're living in more like frantic, urgent states that don't serve us at all. But that creates a certain neurochemical path in the brain. And that neurochemical path is considered a trauma pathway. So if we don't fix the neurochemistry and give ourselves more of, say, serotonin or oxytocin, and if we don't fix the gut so that the gut tells the brain what to release, then we're always going to be in deficit. And it's going to make it harder for the brain to work through the trauma. So one of the things that I do when I work with people is there's a company I found, gosh, probably 3 years ago now. And they actually, if you've ever seen the movie Limitless, their technology is based on, or the movie was based on their technology. And their technology allowed you to turn down your nervous system so your brain can release more of the healthy chemicals. So it's pretty fascinating. Finally, that last piece of trauma could be addressed, that neurochemical side.
I'm not sure if I'm going to phrase this question correctly, but hopefully you kind of get where I'm going to go with it. Are there certain people that are more like types? And maybe this is going to take us to maybe some of this gut health microbiome thing that are maybe more susceptible to traumatic events having a impact on them, because everybody has trauma, right? But the way that we perceive that, the way that trauma has an impact on the outcome of our life, are there people that are more susceptible? And the reason why I'm asking this is because I had Dr. Mahmoud Ghanem on, and he discovered the gut microbiome. So you have the microbiome, and then you have the myco, which is like a smaller little area that kind of sits somewhere in and around it. But it had all these impacts, and we got into the conversation on birth, right? And how it's better for children to be born I don't I, birth canal as opposed to a C-section, because when you pass through the birth canal, like you said, you're getting some of that bacteria. So C-section people, are they more susceptible to traumatic things having a deep impact on them? Is the question making any sense there?
You know, yeah, I get what you're saying. I don't necessarily think it's just that. I think that you're susceptible to trauma based on so many different factors, right? It's the environment, it's the bacteria in your gut, it's how your brain functions, it's the people that are around you. Like there's so much that goes into creating the environment of the trauma. But I do think that if you have like poor nutrition, it can for sure cause deficit in the brain, right? So everything from like even daily drugs, right? Caffeine, alcohol, all of that can cause a deficit in the brain, which makes trauma, I guess, excuse me for a second, I'm going to sneeze. It makes trauma a little bit more, I guess, easier for the body to be in, right? Because if you're, let's say, in a depressed state, then it'll be easier to stay in victim mentality or to stay in the traumatized state than it would be if your serotonin was working really well for you.
Yeah, when you were sharing some of these things with me in Nashville, and it was like another one of those light bulb moments. Like, there's an entire nutritional protocol within our program. For me, it was the carnivore diet. Like I went 60 days of eating beef only way back in 2019. And I knew for certain, like I couldn't piece it together back then. I was like, this is having an impact on the way that my brain is changing and how I'm beginning to see the world. And it's become a major part of our curriculum in the fasting side as well. So when you said that, like the gut health has like the microbiome has such an impact on our brain. Like it was just one of those things. It was like, oh, like
It's It's massive. And it's the part that so many people don't put time, energy, and effort into. They think that a prebiotic or a probiotic is going to help set the gut up for success, but it really, you need some of these things that the gut really no longer produces. And you can only find them, in companies that have created perfect microbiomes in the lab and then fed them whatever that biome needs to release the cell signaling agents to change the brain. So it's much more technologically savvy than we might think, but that neurochemistry is the missing piece for sure.
so once we get to gut health in check, then like what are the next steps to rewrite or reprogram the neurochemistry? Are there active things that we can be doing?
Well, one of the things that we talk about a lot is really being aware of what lies you're telling yourself. Because once the gut biome is functioning at a higher level, and then your neurochemistry is higher, and your nervous system is turned down, and you're calmer, and you're getting deeper sleep, then your body is, or your brain at least, is more neuroplastic. So then you have the ability to learn things in an easier way. So usually when that happens, I'm like, okay, once your brain gets to that easier, calmer state, what if you could start looking at the lies that you're telling yourself and start questioning them? So there are a lot of lies for people in, everywhere from business to just in normal life where, like somebody in your audience might tell themselves like, I've always been this way. I'm always going to be this way. Like this thing that happened when I was a kid, like say, for example, I had a client and when he was a really young kid, porn was introduced very young and he didn't really understand it at the time. But now he's like, I think because I was introduced to it that young, that I'm always going to be a certain way. And what I usually do in those moments is I introduce them to Carol Dweck's book, which is all about mindset. And there's a whole fixed mindset versus growth mindset that people who think they're always going to be a certain way, once you read that book, it forever changes what you know to be true about how the brain works. So that's another piece. If people are in victim mentality or they think, no, I'm always going to be this way, once you read that growth mindset book by Carol Dweck, everything changes and you learn, nope, as long as I put my mind to learning something new and changing, I can change almost everything that I want to change. Now, if we can get your neurochemistry to be healthier and your gut to be healthier, then it's a lot faster to change those things that you want to change.
Yeah, Carol's work has been, I mean, so influential in what we're doing here, literally to the point where like I call our company like we're the growth centric recovery program because I believe in that. And that's definitely one that I hear a lot, right? Is, oh, I was introduced to it at this young age, or I have certain desires and that's why I need porn because whatever won't my wife won't, do these things for me. What are, I know you work with a lot of, business executives and professionals, but are there reoccurring lies that people are telling themselves? I mean, these have to fall into buckets, right?
Well, even I was thinking about your audience today before I got on this podcast, and I was like, I wonder what some of those reoccurring lies might be. So I went back to like former clients from years ago, and what was so interesting to me was just everyday normal men. There's a lie that they tell themselves that they have to perform, right? They have to perform with their spouse or significant other or their girlfriend. And if they don't perform, the woman will be connected, might want to leave. And so I think most men that I've ever met, talked to, learned from, or coached, they all tell me the same thing, that performance is so essential. Like they care more about performing for the woman than they do possibly about, just enjoying the experience. And so I was wondering, as somebody who coaches men that might have that, how do you handle that in part of your coaching? Because I found that so fascinating when I was looking back on, oh, this is a lie that men might tell themselves, and I've for sure observed it. Um, how do you work with that? Because it is partially a trauma and it's partially a mental block. How do you guys get
Yeah.
to
So, I mean, no, so this is great. This is great kind of back and forth here, right? I think, you just got to ask a series of questions because are you feeling lack of performance due to what you've programmed yourself to be the model of performance. We know that pornography is, I mean, it's produced, it's hot, like we've had porn stars on. We know a lot of times, like what you're watching 5 minutes, it actually took an hour through different scenes and camera angles. So are you actually worried about your performance for what you like, or your wife, or what you're capable of? Are you comparing it to what you've seen on the screen? I think that we would open up the conversation there first. And a lot of times he's going to lead himself to the answer. It's like, no, I'm actually comparing. It'd be like I'm going out and I'm shooting basketballs and like I'm comparing myself to Michael Jordan and I'm just playing at a rec, or I'm playing at, the local pickup game. If I videoed myself and I'd be going watching them, it's like, of course I'm not going to look like Michael Jordan when I'm shooting the basketball. No reason to. So that's probably where I would go. But
Yeah, and the comparison, I find it's like the thief of all joy. Like if you're comparing even to 4 or 5 minutes ago, you're comparing to a lack of reality, right? And instead of being in the moment and enjoying what it is. So I think that that's dead on what you're saying about people comparing themselves. And that is also a lie, right? It's the lie that I have to compare myself in order to drive myself forward in some way, in order to fuel myself differently. So one of the things I ask men to think about a lot, and hopefully the men that listen to you will apply this, is okay, when I'm in the space trying to figure out what my lie might be, what is the reoccurring thought that I have over and over in my head that drives me forward in a negative way? So a lot of men might be telling themselves, "Oh, I'm a mediocre performer," or I'm just not good at this, or I'll never be good at that, X, Y, or Z. And that's the lie that they use for fuel. Because most men don't use something positive for fuel; they use something negative to fuel themselves to do more, be more, get more. So I've definitely seen that as something to address.
now, what if that is the case though? What if like I don't want to say on the performance side, but on like not good enough, or like I'm struggling with this. Like, what if that is actually the truth? Like, and then you're going to start lying to yourself about your own reality.
Well, I think the key is if anyone in the audience is thinking like, what if I'm not good enough, or maybe I'm not good enough, then there's a part of you that gets to decide in that moment, what do I want to be true? That is the most powerful question that I think anyone can ever ask themselves. What do I want to be true? Because if you're faced with, okay, maybe I'm comparing myself to somebody else, I'm never going to be good enough, versus, okay, what if I ask myself, what do I want to be true in this moment? I want it to be true that no matter what, I am always improving. Therefore, I will always work towards being good enough. And that's the truth I want to live into. So, what action do I need to take to make that truth my reality? So, that question of what do I want to be true is the freedom question for almost everybody when you're stuck in comparison or victim mentality or even trauma.
Yeah, and it's like in that moment, like a very powerful three-letter word would be yet, right? Like, I've shot some videos and I've had this conversation like, I'm always going to be addicted to pornography because I don't know how to overcome this. And it's like,
I
oh,
haven't
you're
overcome
not
it
always going to
yet.
be addicted because you don't know how to overcome it.
Right.
Yeah, I shot an entire
Yeah.
video on like how these three letters can become the most
Amazing.
powerful words in your life. I mean, you
That's
literally
right.
in any situation. Like, yeah, I'm not as good as Michael Jordan shooting a three-pointer
Yeah.
yet, but if I put in the work, I can develop those skills to get to the best of my ability. I want to take a slight pivot here and talk about vulnerability because it was one of the things that you brought up before we started talking, that you've been getting a lot of men specifically in one of the business groups that I'm involved in that are struggling with being vulnerable. I don't think it's for me. I don't know if I ever actually even thought about it. It's like I just when I launched the podcast, it's like I just felt that this needed to get put out there, and there was never a hesitation. Like I recorded a 90-minute episode 1, where I was I literally shared everything, like 30 years of mistakes, drugs, sex, porn, alcohol, business failures, misguided relationships, like just put it all out there. And Andy, that was like the greatest day of my life. Like I felt so connected to every person I met for like the next month. But why do men in general seem to struggle with vulnerability?
Well, I think men in general struggle with vulnerability because they've been conditioned their whole lives that if you show emotions, you are not a man, which is one of the greatest lies out there, right? And it's a way to restrict the emotional connection ability of a man. If most men understood that the more emotionally connected they were to themselves and the more they were able to share those moments of vulnerability with a woman, the more attracted she would be to them and the better the sex would be. Like, it's not even a question. If you have an emotional connection with someone, because as a man, he's sharing his deepest fears, his concerns, he's even maybe getting emotional about it, that shows you that that person is willing to meet you in that emotional space. But a lot of men repress all that emotionality because of a lie that started when they were younger, and that becomes part of the trauma that they're in. Because think about how it must feel who can't feel all of these different parts of themselves. It's in essence a repression of a big part of who you are if you don't allow yourself to feel all the emotions that are you.
So a lot of times the lack of the ability to be vulnerable or even the willingness to want to get vulnerable is deep rooted in some type of trauma. So it
Correct. Yep.
always
And I think
always comes back to trauma.
almost everything comes back to trauma. Almost everything. Like the lack of the finances you want in your life, the lack of the connection, the lack of the relationship you want. It all comes back to whether or not you're willing to unravel some of those trauma pieces that have repressed certain aspects of you over the years.
What's an example on the finance side of where something like that could show up?
So, yep. So on the finance side, maybe you have a story, right, that you created as a kid that I was always poor, right? And so, say I worked with one gentleman where he had a single mom who was raising him. He was always poor. He only ever used candles because they didn't have electricity. And because of that, he created the story that I will never be poor again. And so his entire life, he went after money. But when he went after money, he didn't go after relationships. He went after how do I get money the quickest? So he cut off most of the deep relationships in his life and didn't value that. So when he was then at the point of his life where he had all this money and all he wanted was to be in a relationship with someone, he couldn't attract anybody because he literally didn't know how to build connection or vulnerability with a significant other because he had never done that. He shut that whole part of himself off to make all the money. So that's, an example of an old program that was running him, the program that I will never be, I will never be able, or I will never, not have money. I will always have money. But in doing so, I have to repress certain aspects of myself. Therefore, when you finally get to the moment when the environment's changed, now you want nothing more than connection and a relationship. That old story was still running him. That old trauma was still leading the charge.
Kind of answered another question I was going to ask you, which is like, what happens when you begin to use trauma as like the source of fuel for attacking your goals? And it's like it can be very powerful in that one lane, but it's eventually going to lead to.
Correct. I mean, it's very powerful to a certain limitation because you will put yourself into a box from which you cannot go any higher. And when that happens, you're literally, if you think about it like a bracket, you're telling yourself, I am only good enough to get to this point and I can't go any further because to go further would be the unknown. And my subconscious brain and my trauma won't allow me to go any further. So that's usually where a lot of entrepreneurs will find me and Larry because they're like, I've been hitting the same wall over and over and over again. I'm recreating the same loop over and over again. Like they'll make a bunch of money, then they'll lose it all. They'll make a bunch of money, then they'll lose it all. It's because they're in the same negative trauma loop. They don't know how to get out. So that is something that happens over and over again. And most people will play out the same trauma loop over and over again, just a different context throughout their entire lives until they work to unravel it.
Until they find you and Larry. So hearing you say that it's a powerful source, like then would you like let's say you're talking to like a young entrepreneur, like up and coming, like and you can see like this kid's got potential, but he's fueling himself off of some of these traumas. Would you advise that young man or woman like what would your advice there be? Like use this to a certain point, but then know that you're going to have to get it, or would you try to help them even in the early stages, knowing that it may slow down some of their progress and growth, right? Because if it's such a
Well,
powerful force of
that's the
fuel,
biggest.
if you heal it too early, can it halt some of the growth?
Well, I think that's the greatest fear, right? If I heal this too early, will I lose my drive? Will I lose my ambition? Will I lose that rapid fire pace, right? And I always say to the people that are doing this, I'm like, have you honed the skill for most of your life? Yes, you have. So, like for Larry, think about Larry as a Navy SEAL, right? He shot millions of rounds through his gun. If he decides to let the Navy SEAL badass not lead the charge so that he isn't having to be hyper aware all the time, but he lets that Navy SEAL sit on the sidelines, that's that subconscious part of him rest, is he going to lose that skill set? Absolutely not. The skill set is still there and he can pull on it and use it whenever he needs to, but it's not driving the bus. So for a younger person, the first thing I would tell them is I would say, before you do anything in business, you need to do some personal development work to figure out who you really are and how to be congruent with who you are. because nothing you create without being congruent will be part of your calling. That's why most of us in business go through 15, 20 years of trying all these different things because we're not sure what's going to work because none of us work on our traumas. Now, you, on the other hand, you're so inspirational because I'm like, he went after this from the get go, went super vulnerable, shared all these things, started working on it. And that's why you're in your calling now. So if you want to be in your calling earlier and faster, then it's important to do the work earlier and faster. If you don't and you're open to whatever the journey is for yourself, just get after it.
Yeah, see, Annie, you're not seeing the decade of corporate failure, like getting fired from every job after being there for 18 months to 2 years because I was just this rap. Like I'd come in and I'd crush it, and then I'd get bored. And I was like, "What's next?" And they wouldn't have anything for me. So corporate America was out the window. Started business entrepreneurship at 30. First company, pretty quick success, but it like within 3 years lost it all. Second company, no success at all. So what may look like I got here early has almost 2 decades of failures behind it. So
Well, that's the whole point, right? Like nobody gets anywhere fast. We all get there by going through at least decades of failures. And most of those decades of failures have to do with our trauma. And I wish more people would talk about this, right? People don't get to these extreme positions in life because they haven't failed. Everyone fails over and over and over again. And we have to work through the trauma side for quite a bit of time to finally decide, man, I don't want to do it this way
yeah,
anymore.
that's why it's amazing what
Where
you
all the growth starts from.
yeah, it's amazing what you and Larry are doing to try to, maybe speed up this growth for some of these people. Annie, this has been amazing. I want to make sure I don't hold you here too long because I know you have something here coming up. What are some resources from people? Maybe if they're, like obviously want to drive them to look at what you're doing, but there'll be a lot of people hearing this that aren't at the level to begin working with you guys. If they want to start exploring some of these stories that they're telling themselves or begin to explore how maybe trauma is impacting their life outside of this conversation, where would you kind of direct people?
So there are a couple of different things you can do. If you just want to start on the basic level, you can start looking for repeating patterns in your life and then start asking yourself, why am I repeating these same patterns? So that's on the individual level of what you can do. Then there's a bunch of different things you can do on the sort of spiritual healing side. You can go after learning about the emotion code. You can learn about your human design. You can learn about tapping. You can do EMDR. Those are a bunch of really interesting things that you can do. You can see a somatic body worker. All of those different aspects are things that you can do individually for yourself just to enhance your own awareness. Then there are personal development programs. There's, I think, Ascension Leadership Academy in Texas, Austin, Texas, and they do an incredible job at getting people to open up to more aspects of who they are and to really look at some of these trauma patterns. And then, from there, you could, I know that there are some pretty incredible experiences that are overseas or internationally that you can experience too. So I would just say, as much as you can, go after personal development. As long as you're continually learning and growing and learning more about yourself, you'll be able to identify some of these patterns, and then that will be where all the growth starts. But it's an onion. You're constantly you're constantly taking layer after layer after layer off. I've been doing this for probably 8 years now, and even yesterday, I had a whole new realization about myself. I'm like, oh my gosh, look at that! After 8 years, it's still the unwinding of the onion, the unraveling of the trauma. So just be excited and curious about whatever's coming for you in this instead of holding it as part of your identity. That trauma gets to be released so that you can have more of who you are in this world and in your life.
Yeah, that's been I don't think fun is the right word, but that's been the part about this that has really enjoyed me is like these last 3 years. Like I feel like I've known Frank like more than I knew for the first 36 years. It's like once you begin to go through this healing process, you look forward to it because you're like, just like you said, like you learn more about your past self, but then you get closer to that next version. I want to ask two rapid fire questions here. Hopefully I can get these. I don't know if you're familiar because you said something on the spiritual, like the spirituality side of things. So are you familiar with Dr. Jordan Peterson or with his work at all?
Yes.
Okay, so he has said that because he got his very early work was in the alcohol addiction space. One of the things I heard him say way back early on when I was reading some of his books is all recovery from addiction requires a spiritual transformation. And his definition of spiritual transformation there is you need to begin to look at your life as having a deeper sense of meaning or purpose. How does that kind of play in healing from trauma?
Well, I would say that it is completely linked because trauma, I mean, at least the way Larry and I consider it, trauma is it's a way that you get pushed off center from your divine connection. So if every trauma pushes you off center from that divine connection, our whole life is about finding our way back to that center so that we can be in connection with that divinity that is a part of us and what we are all made from. So I think that we for sure, I would be in agreement with Dr. Peterson that if you don't believe that you're here for something bigger and greater than what you're currently experiencing, you're missing out on how that trauma is going to get you to your calling, and it's going to get you to the greatest lesson that you're here to learn and teach others. So I
Incredible.
think
Yeah.
he's dead on.
Yeah. No, and Larry are going to explore that topic next week when we get him back on pretty deep.
Good. It'll be fast.
Last question. How would you define living a superhuman life?
Oh, wow. Living a superhuman life, I would say living a superhuman life is living from a place of unconditional love and presence at every moment of the day.
Annie Yatch, I love you so much. Thank you,
Oh, you too.
just
This is so great. Thanks for
for your
having me.
time. Yeah, no, I'm excited about your work back in the Seven Figure Mastermind. I know that there's going to be some more great things. I'm going to have way more questions for you. Are you going to be in Vegas in September?
I am going to be in Vegas in September. Yep.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a whole slew of questions. Guys, you heard it out here. Thank you so much. If you want to continue to help us grow and support this show, one of two ways. You can leave us a 5-star rating and written review. But most important, if there's somebody in your life that needs to hear today's conversation, do us a favor and do them the blessing of sharing this with them. But for Annie Yatch at SEAL Team Leaders, Frank Rich, we love you guys, and we'll see you next week.